So I'll talk a little bit about my recent interest. I've been studying tourism and the geography of tourism and tourism planning and development for almost 30 years now. So a little bit of a background about myself for those of you who don't know me. Obviously, my name is not Swedish. I'm from Cyprus originally, Chypre. But I basically have lived in the US and Britain, and for the last 10 years or so I've been in Sweden. So I'm a kind of a global nomad, an academic nomad. I'm very interested in the so-called economic geography of tourism. So looking at tourism as maybe not a industry per se, but as a phenomenon that has economic dimensions. And I have been looking at that for the better part of 25 years or so. It's one of the main areas I've looked at. And about 10 years ago, I started getting interested in the relationship of tourism work and workers in the sustainability debate, the tourism sustainability debate. So let's see, Okay, so by the way, the people online, can you hear me? Can somebody say something?
Very well.
Okay,
Very well.
Good.
Yes.
All right.
Perfect.
All right. So there's a growing body of research on tourism work and workers, even though probably until a few years ago people would say that there wasn't a lot of research on this particular topic. It has grown quite a lot in the last 10, 15 years. And there's research about workers' mobility, migration and issues like that, about precariousness or precarity is a big topic, not just in tourism studies, but in general. If you look at labor geography, a lot of the work that has been written talks about the precarization of the global workforce, if you like. In terms of tourism, there's quite a lot written about the horizontal and vertical division of labor, basically division between the sexes, between races, but also a division between the back office and the front office parts of a business and issues like that. Or if you look at a cruise ship, you can kind of look at the cruise ship and look at the hotel side of it vis-a-vis the operational side of the boat, and then you have all sorts of divisions throughout that. Then, of course, there's quite a lot of discussion in recent times about the geographies of the tourism workers themselves, and including the work by a Canadian researcher called Stephen Tufts, who's written a lot about the agency of workers. The workers are not entirely without agency, that they do make decisions. Of course, some workers have more agency than others, and I'll return to that point a little bit later on. And then also I have a colleague who has recently been looking at harassment in the workplace, both sexual harassment but also bullying and issues like that. And there's more publications coming out on that aspect. About 8 years ago, Adele Latkin from Bournemouth University published a paper where she called for further research on how workers might build their skills through employment. One of the problems that we have in large parts of the tourism industry is that very often we accuse it, or observers accuse it, that it's basically low-skilled jobs, which basically is a problematic issue. So how can workers through their employment actually build their skills? Or how should we be able to define jobs better in order to actually be able to count the jobs and actually do research about this, because that's part of the problem, is we don't have enough information about what is a tourism job and what isn't in many environments. And also she talked about, for example, what labor mobility means in terms of shifts in working life overall, and what the effects of international migration implies for integration, cohesion, and national identity. So this was what Latkin was talking about, I think in 2014. But the question I'm going to talk about today is, what role does tourist-related work and workers play in the context of sustainable development? There's a lot of literature, thousands of papers written for the last 30 years about sustainable development, about sustainability in the tourism sector. But how does tourist work and how do tourism workers fit in that discussion? And how does the precariousness or the precarity that characterizes the jobs in the tourism sector match the need to create what the UN calls decent work? Also, the ILO uses the term decent work. What do we mean by decent work? And how does the fact that on the one hand we have precariousness in the labor force match the fact that we are actually trying to provide decent jobs? I always like to start off this kind of lecture or this thought process by looking at George Orwell, who wrote many years ago, one of his early books was a book called Down and Out in Paris and London. And at that time he was a young aspiring author. This was before he came to Spain during the Civil War. He was living in Paris, as a lot of authors wanted to do at that time. And of course, he basically had no money. So one of the things he did is, in order to survive, he basically took a job as a dishwasher, or what the French call a plongeur. And he has this great line in the book where he says, "I think I should start by saying that the plongeur, or the dishwasher, is one of the slaves of the modern world. He is no freer." Notice at that time when he writes, he's just talking about males. As my wife would say, females have not been invented yet in the 1930s. So he is no freer than if they were bought and sold. His work is servile and without art. He is paid just enough to keep him alive, and his only holiday is the sack, is getting fired. And I think this piece of literature, if you like, entirely encapsulates the attitude that a lot of people have towards tourism work. Of course, this is probably at the lower end of it. But there is kind of a dumbing down, if you like, very often in both from a policy process, maybe not in all countries, of course there's difference, and it's context specific also, but definitely in the Western world, in the northern countries, there's definitely kind of this approach that tourism is a in-between job. It's a job for young people, it's a job for new immigrants and things like that. It's not something that you do to build a career. Now, of course, I know there might be differences in the Mediterranean, in Spain, Greece, whatever. That might not be entirely the case, but it's certainly, there is kind of this Western-centric idea that tourism very often is a kind of in-between job. So also, if we talk a little bit about precarity, some of the interesting work that has been done on precarity in recent times is the work by Lambert and Herod. Herod is a professor of human geography at the University of Georgia, Athens. Actually, he did his PhD at the same time I did my PhD years and years ago at Rutgers University. And he was a student, if those of you who are geographers might have known of Neil Smith. So he was a student of Neil Smith. And we always joke that Andy, or Andrew, was the academic grandson of David Harvey, because David Harvey was Neil Smith's advisor, and Neil Smith was the advisor of Andy. And Andy basically is one of the eminent people in labor geography. And he has written very much about the fact that workers are not basically just passive agents, always basically following the whims and wills of of capital, that they do have agency to a certain extent. Of course, it depends on the context, where they are, their geography, and things like that. But he talks about the fact that precarity in the labor force has increased in recent years. And that's because of the neoliberal times that we live in, where things like workers' rights, like unions, for example, have lost power. We know that, for example, governments have cut down on things like social benefits and welfare and things like that in many countries. Basically, what it translates into is a lot of people working very irregular schedules, very often on zero-hour contracts. As you might have heard about, a zero-hour contract, if you don't know, is essentially where your employer basically hires you and doesn't actually give you an assignment. And basically, at times when the hotel or the restaurant is really, really busy, they basically say, okay, well, you need to be on standby, but for a long time, maybe you're doing nothing. And then you're not getting any benefits, you're not getting any sick leave, et cetera, et cetera. Also, the gig economy, the so-called platform economy or the collaborative economy, depending on what flavor of the month you like. So the Ubers, the Deliveroos, all of these kind of companies that are based on platforms, that has basically accelerated this precarity. The fact that a lot of people are basically just living basically off their mobile, doing different tasks as needed. And one of the things is this an Australian academic by the name of Robinson, who has written quite a lot about labor in recent times. And he basically says that the very nature of the tourism and hospitality sector, which is in many respects seasonal, it depends on basically the peaks and troughs of demand. It basically lends itself not to a stable labor force, that the labor force actually goes up and down, both in terms of numerical flexibility, meaning that the numbers go up and down, but also functional flexibility, where maybe one worker actually does multiple tasks. And then, of course, the other issue that, especially at the entry level of the tourism sector and the hospitality sector, is that many jobs basically have very low skill requirements, meaning that the barriers to entry are extremely low, which then by default means that the employers can exploit the workers' weak bargaining position. And this is stuff that, of course, people like Tom Baum have written a lot about, and there's been studies about it, but it's certainly very visible in the tourism sector and the hospitality sector. Now, having said that, we should also add that precarity is not only a negative, that a lot of people actually nowadays kind of welcome the ability to be able to work kind of on a flexible kind of basis. Of course, those are probably not people at the lower end of the job market. These are probably people who are actually quite well educated, people who possibly make quite a lot of money because of the skills they have and the services they offer. Or they're people who might be kind of semi-retired and maybe they work, they have other sources of income and maybe they want to work occasionally, just so as they don't get bored or something. As it says there, certain workers prefer performing contingent work, meaning that work as it comes. If it pays well, sure, I'll do it, because it's flexible, and also because I can work from home during the hours that I want. Maybe I know a lot of people now in Sweden. What has happened is a lot of people actually who are on the high end of the labor pool, for example, software engineers and things, are moving out to some really remote parts of Sweden, deciding to live there because they're big outdoor recreation people, and so what they want to do is ski. And you get some of the best cross-country skiing, for example, out there. But then they can telecommute with their companies in Gothenburg or in Stockholm and things like that. They don't actually have to sit at a desk or at the desk at an office. So there is kind of the idea that precarity can actually be a positive. But the problem is on the downside, as I've marked in yellow there. There's been a trend in recent years where capitalism and the kind of constant pursuit of basically capital reinvention, if you like, has prompted employers to look for ways to cut their costs. And by doing so, they basically, as I say there, they look for contingent workers that are basically available as the mainstay of their labor force, and to force contingent work on people involuntarily. And this is where I think the hospitality sector and tourism is actually finds itself at a kind of a good poster child of this phenomenon. And of course, a lot of these workers are particularly vulnerable. If you're familiar with the work of Linda McDowell, for example, she talks about, and also Robinson, they talk about the intersectionality of the fact that a lot of these workers basically are women, they're ethnic minorities, they're migrants, sometimes legal migrants, often not legal, so they don't have much of a bargaining power. They're young and belong to maybe different marginal groups. So something to be aware of. Now, no talk these days would be enough if we didn't talk about the effects of the pandemic also. I mean, the pandemic is basically squeezed into every discussion that we have these days. So of course, the pandemic, there's no point in going into the economic disasters that it caused, but it definitely exposed a vulnerability among some people more than others. Now, of course, for us academics or for people working in essentially a lot of the higher end services, working at home was not a problem, and in fact it became de rigueur. I mean, people actually, nowadays probably do work from home, and a lot of more and more companies are actually promoting that. But when it comes to services, where you actually have to wait on a person or do something that's basically like cleaning or whatever, obviously you can't do that remotely unless you hire robots, which might be the next thing at some stage, but we haven't yet internationally reached that level. So the problem that the pandemic actually exposed is, while it was fine for people like teachers and things to work from home, it was not fine for people who had actually managed to keep their jobs. Not a lot of people lost their jobs, but the people who kept their jobs in the hospitality sector, for example, they had to go to work. And the problem that they had is that if they said, hey, I don't want to come to work because I'm afraid of getting sick, I'm asthmatic, whatever, they very often ended up being the first people to be fired and not get any benefits and things like that. And Boyens has done some work on Scottish hospitality workers, for example, where she says that basically these people were verbally and sometimes even physically abused both by their bosses, but also by customers. For basically that became a big problem. And we all know, I think, especially if you read the American media, in America especially, the phenomenon of air rage against flight attendants has become ridiculous. I mean, people actually getting really upset because the rule of the airline, for example, is please put your mask on. Some of these, dare I say it, Trump supporters or crazies are out there saying, I don't want to put my mask, you're not going to force me to do so. And then there's basically big fights going on flights, and flights having to land and people getting arrested and so on. And the people who are actually at the front end of the harassment, if you like, were the flight attendants. And actually a lot of flight attendants, I have a colleague whose son is married to a flight attendant. She was working for Delta, and she basically said, enough is enough, I'm not doing it anymore. After somebody basically almost punched her, she was essentially said, I'm out of this business. And it became really, really bad in the aftermath of the pandemic. Now, so I come to the main point. I've talked about the precarity. I've talked about the fact that the jobs, especially at the entry side of things, are basically low skill, and people can get a job but can also very easily lose a job. The jobs are not well paid. They don't have good benefits, etc., etc. But the question I have is, when we talk about sustainable development or tourism and sustainability, which is, if anybody studies tourism, is the number one topic that people look at. We always talk about sustainability. We use that term sustainability. Increasingly, we now also use the term resilience. But the problem is, when it comes to sustainability and work, and tourism work and workers, there's very little actually on the topic. Certainly not as much as we see about economic growth vis-a-vis the environment. For many, many years, the debate has been, environment versus economic growth, balancing those two, which is only two parts of the so-called triangle of sustainability. The social equity part, especially when it comes to workers, has been a little bit brushed aside. Maybe we see more on terms of like the communities and community empowerment and things like that, but not specifically about workers. Now, one of the issues, of course, is that when we talk about sustainability, especially if you talk to policymakers, their view of sustainability is very different to the view of, say, Greenpeace, or the view of most of us academics. If you talk to anybody, especially after the pandemic, a lot of people were saying, well, the industry has basically collapsed. It needs to come back to a certain level, and we understand that. We need to, recapture the growth we had before. And it doesn't matter whether you're in Spain, Sweden, the United States. The rhetoric you hear in most municipalities is basically some kind of sustainable growth. And it's all about arrivals and receipts. Sometimes you'll see some people say, we can increase the quality and attract higher spending tourists and things like that. But as a colleague of mine, Jeff Wall, many years ago said, there's only a finite number of people with money who will spend so much money that you can only bring a few into a destination. Plus, we had a discussion about this last week when I was at Rovira e Virgili, about the fact that it also is problematic to promote tourism just for a very, very small class of people, a small number of people, because then it becomes very undemocratic. And of course, the other issue, when it comes to the environment also, we can actually say that people who have promoted environmental sustainability, especially from the policy side, they don't view the environment so much from the same side as, say, Greenpeace or Friends of the Earth. They view the environment or the environmental protection more from a point of view that if we don't protect the environment, what does it mean for the tourism industry? If the environment gets so poor, so overrun by development or so, polluted or whatever, then the tourists are not going to come. So it's always, even the environmental protection is viewed from a point of view of essentially an economic kind of benefit, if you like. Now, on the other hand, those people who, for example, advocate for workers' rights and who talk about enhanced social equity, they don't, when it comes to tourism scholars, they basically are not too explicit about the relationship of the workers, the workplace, and sustainability. There's kind of a gap there that is missing, and very few people have actually talked about that. Now, why is this absence there? Many reasons for that. The number one reason, which is a reason that we see often in tourism studies, is this inability to really define what we mean by a tourism job, and the fact that there is no industrial classification code to basically define one tourism job. Tourism can be a variety of jobs, and in different destinations it can be quite different. I mean, it could be retailing, could be tourism, or it could be something very specific, like parts of the transportation system and so on. Now, to kind of look for more reason for this, there's a very well-known paper that Jarkko Saarinen wrote back in 2006, where he uses the resource and community-based approach to viewing tourism sustainability. And on the one hand, when you look at the resource-based perspective of sustainability, so looking at tourism resources, workers are actually not examined because workers are part of a global tourism production system. They're not regarded as something endogenous to a destination. They're not part of the destination, especially in destinations where you rely very often not just on the community to be doing the jobs, but a lot on migrant workers. And so that's the resource-based perspective. When it comes to the community-based perspective, also workers are kind of sidestepped or ignored because most people who look at the community, again, they look basically, what does tourism mean for the hosts, for the local community who lives there? What are the benefits? What are the negatives? How do we improve the benefits? How do we kind of lose the negatives? And since, especially in, maybe not in large cities, but certainly in a lot of destinations around the world, a lot of seasonal destinations, seaside destinations, or winter tourism destinations, the workers are there for only a small part of the year. They're not part of the equation. They're not part of the community. They're outside. So they're not really, very often they're not even counted. In Sweden, for example, they're not counted because in Sweden you are counted as to where your permanent residence is. So say you're a student who lives in Stockholm and you work in Åre, which is the big ski resort, for 3 months a year, but you don't actually, you keep your parents' address, for example. You then, when you pay your taxes on your paycheck, the tax benefit goes to Stockholm. It doesn't go to the destination because you haven't actually declared the resort as your community. Of course, that might vary from place to place, but that's certainly an issue in the Scandinavian countries, for example. Now, a lot has been made about the so-called decent work. And you see it in a lot of publications by the ILO, for example, had, I think it was in 2017, it talked about decent work, and the United Nations Agenda for Sustainable Development that has its 17 Sustainable Development Goals, or SDGs. If you look at goal number 8, for example, it basically talks about promoting sustained, inclusive and sustainable economic growth, full and productive employment, and decent work. But it never says what decent work is. What is decent work? So I basically looked through the literature trying to find both from an academic point of view and also an international organization. So there's a paper by Winchenbach, or Wichenbach, I don't know how you pronounce that. I think she's at the University of Surrey, where she argues that a broad definition of the term should incorporate aspects of respect, self-respect, as well as safe, fair, productive, and meaningful working conditions of freedom. So that's her definition. If you look at the ILO, they look at decent work, and this is a document from 1999, which looks at decent work as incorporating the elimination of forced labor. So basically not using child labor, for example, being able to work without discrimination, without harassment, the right to have access to collective bargaining, which in many cases we know that's not true, and also the ability not to work over a certain amount of hours, that your employer pays social security contributions, and you get benefits including leave and also sick leave, which many of us in kind of regular jobs get, but not necessarily people, especially in the precariat, certainly don't. So if that's the case, then where are the decent jobs, if you like? So then, as I say here, is how can this work, or the tourism and hospitality work, actually be decent? I've just mentioned, if we have eroding bargaining power because unions don't have much power, and we know even in Scandinavia, I was surprised when I moved to Scandinavia, because I thought this is the country, or one of the countries that in Sweden where you'd think that unions have a lot of power, and actually that's not true. Not anymore. They're very neoliberal in the way they operate. So people might belong to a union, but unions really don't really stick out their necks to protect. They usually have kind of prearranged agreements with the employers, and they have an agreement that lasts a few years, and basically this is the rate of pay that goes up or down or whatever it is that goes on. Plus, a lot of people don't join the unions because they don't think that they're very effective anymore. And the other problem that emerges is that, for example, if you work for one of these jobs that you're only working temporarily, precariously, you're not going to be able to join the union. Plus the fact you have to pay to join the union is not an automatic kind of belonging. So people don't feel they're going to get anything out of it. And the other thing is, if you look at people like Bianchi and Deman from a paper in 2020, they actually talk about the fact, also they criticize decent work as it appears in the SDGs, because they say it indicates language that focuses on growth, like total number of jobs created. The employment multiplier, that's the thing that's always the myth in many respects that's spun by a lot of policymakers. Or, we promote this hotel, or we build this event, or develop, this, industry to generate jobs, and then those jobs will actually have an employment multiplier. Incidentally, next week we have a PhD student, and if anybody's interested, I can share the Zoom link. He's going to be defending his thesis on precisely measuring the jobs created through a new system, where basically instead of looking at total number of jobs that are created, he actually looks at the types of jobs that are created. So if a hotel generates jobs, he basically breaks down the hotel between the workers who are in the front end, the back end, the cleaners, the managers, people working in the grounds, the people cleaning the pools and things like that. So there will be a defense next Thursday afternoon at 1:15, I believe. So if anybody's interested, I can share the Zoom link with you. It'll be at our university, and Tom Baum will actually be the examiner for this, so if anybody's interested in that. So basically, this focus on decent work, as promoted by the ILO and the United Nations, ends up being rather ineffective during especially this neoliberal era in which we live. So the question then arises, and a few people have been writing about this in more recent times, like this Wickenbach and also Irma Boyens. They talk about, rather than basically just talking about decent jobs, maybe we should be actually looking at the concept of dignity in the workplace. Boyens, for example, suggests to get beyond this problematic perspective of tourism work, the best way is to look at jobs in the sector as occupations. So she says, don't call tourism jobs a job, call them an occupation, because an occupation gives it a status. What is your occupation? As opposed to I clean dishes, or I bus tables, or whatever. Boyens basically says that maybe we should be talking about the term occupation because it gives a sense of purpose. And if you think about it traditionally, if you look at the sociology of work, for example, there used to be things, I'm sure there still are, I haven't looked at the literature in the time, but there used to be things like lists of occupational status, using the word occupation. So she's basically saying maybe we should go back to that, because one of the things that occupation does, it basically provides this concept of dignity in the workplace. So what do we mean by dignity? Let's see. So basically, there's a very good article by Wickenbach from 19, where they urge us to shift our attention to three things: the individual worker, the organizational context, and the wider socioeconomic and policy context. And each of these perspectives, if you look at the worker, if you look at the organizational context and the wider policy and socioeconomic context, each of these generates both obstacles that hinder the attainment of dignity, but also opportunities to get dignity. So, for example, if you look at workers as factors of production, kind of in a traditional economic sense, there's no discussion about dignity. But if you talk about generating what we call a living wage, which is not exactly the same thing as a minimum wage. A minimum wage would be normally a national set wage limit or minimum limit, which is problematic to a certain extent because you have big differences, say, between very expensive cities and countryside, big cities and smaller cities, things like that. If you talk about the living wage, then what happens is you adjust. You might have a minimum wage in the entire country, but what you do is you adjust the wage in cities like New York City or Barcelona or London or Stockholm or whatever to a higher level because the cost of living in these places by default is much higher than it might be in a smaller community. So if you actually had a living wage, that, according to the authors, enhances the concept of dignity. But also, I think this is something from a paper that I and some colleagues wrote recently, where we say that in order to achieve dignity in terms of the three perspectives, the worker, the organizational context, and the socioeconomic and policy context, you have to understand how both the individual and the institutional actors simultaneously generate, perform, and adapt to the regulative, organizational, and technological systems that frame the dignified employment. So how do they react? How do they show resilience, if you like, to these things? And then by doing that, hopefully we can bring the workers and tourism work into the center stage of sustainability. Now, in order to fit tourism work and workers into the sustainability agenda, we have to do certain things. For example, we have to better comprehend how processes like the declining power of unions or constant international migration, which is getting, given all the geopolitical issues that are happening today and also the climate change and so on, is accelerating rather than becoming stable. What effects do those have? The other thing that we need to do is, because sustainability dialogue is often about the destinations themselves, maybe what we should be doing is shifting away the tendency to just look at the destinations as individual cases. We have a lot of case study research in tourism research. Case study, maybe a comparative case study. But what we should be looking at is how do destinations basically interact with things like the guest workers, the international migration, where do these international migrants come from, and so on. And there's two Norwegian researchers, Underfund and Jørg Huslier at the University of Oslo, who have basically talked about using the lens of liminality to understand how temporary and precarious workers themselves, interestingly enough, and this is where it becomes interesting, they talk about the fact that very often themselves, these workers, even though they're precarious and you'd think that they would want to protect themselves, they actually occasionally basically say, no, we like this type of job, or we choose to do this type of job. And there's some very interesting work that has been done by two academics at the University of Lincoln. I just read the paper yesterday, it appeared in the Annals of Tourism Research, where they talked about the fact that when it comes to students, in this case British students, a lot of them basically have to work now because of the increasing fees that they have to pay. But what their paper was about, and their study, was to understand how working as waiters or as barmen or women or cleaners or whatever, how did that basically socialize them in terms of their future career trajectory? So kind of trying to understand, is it something that's going to help you? Is it not? And these kind of issues. Do you actually get something out of that? And of course, what was coming out from their interviews was that a lot of these people will say, well, we know we're being exploited, we're not getting paid very much, but at the same time we appreciate that we have an opportunity to work because it allows us to work in teams, or it allows us to develop our interpersonal skills, or these kind of things, maybe getting these soft skills rather than the hard skills that you might get from an educational system. But of course, that's the one side of it. But again, we come back to this side where we have people who don't have many options or have no options. They might have a doctor's degree from a Syrian university, but because of limited language skills or no language skills, or because a country doesn't recognize your academic credentials, you have to work as somebody washing dishes. You have to work as a plongeur. But when you ask them, why didn't you join the union, or why don't you try to kind of at least make a career out of that, often they don't want to get involved, either because they feel that maybe they'll become like troublemakers, maybe they'll lose their job, they feel very vulnerable, these kind of issues. And as I said earlier, I think one of the problems with a lot of trade unions today is that they're kind of static and rigid. Their membership in a lot of countries has actually declined, and they don't seem to be able to be very reactive to this kind of precarization that is happening, especially with things like the gig economy, if you like. I should add that going back to kind of labor geography, that we should also understand that not all workers, or that workers don't entirely lack agency. I have a colleague who's been doing some very interesting work, and her argument is that workers very often, it's not that their job is below their level, or that basically they're doing a job that they don't like. Maybe they take a job because of other circumstances in their life cycle.